So without further ado, we're going to jump in with some questions. And I'm going to start with one that I've always wanted to ask you, and then we'll maybe start from your life history. But, you know, in listening to you play, you have done such a brilliant balance of respecting the traditions of how our repertoire is to be played, but you are also pushing us forward with new ways of interpreting the music, with your artistic interpretation. And I was wondering if there was anything you might comment on with that artistic process that you go through and
Well,
achieving that balance, because it's absolutely brilliant. Everything you do is so convincing and so full of integrity.
well, thanks for your kind words, but there's something that you must know is that you don't hear everything I do. You don't hear the part that is called practice, the part that is not public. And you have to know that for each hour that is published as a CD, for example, there's about 10 hours of tape. For 10 hours of tape, there's about 100 hours of work behind. So it's what you're hearing is probably the best of put together, edited together in a recording. And this is how the music industry works, actually. But then you go to the concert, and some of the people you admire in the recordings disappoint you a lot, and some other people make you happy. Or some of the places people tell you, oh, it's better than your recording. So it's really very different. We depend so much on the context, and I think that that's a key word for also for interpretation. You were saying respecting the tradition. Where do we all come from? What is this flute about? What is this history in the flute making? What was the ancestor instrument? What did the composers write the music for? I think we have to know this big picture, more or less, by books, by studying, by looking into documents that are available across the net, or by just following the guidance of our teachers, or the artists we admire. And then we collect some information about the context of what it is to play the flute. I was trained, for example, from my very early stage, because my first teacher was also my neighbor in Rome, but was trained in the French school tradition and studied in the Paris Conservatory back in the 30s. And so therefore, studying later than myself, I've been really trained in what we call this French tradition. Now I know the Boston flute makers also have been developing in Boston, for example, this French tradition of the flute making. In the beginning, there were the people repairing the French instruments, like all those old Louis Lott instruments and Coenon instruments. And then they founded companies like Haynes, like Powell, later on like Brannan, like Arista, then Sheridan, and then all the other makers. Sorry for those I forget, but there's just so many. Boston is nowadays one of the capitals of the flute in the world. And this was already the case when I was a student. This is why I came to Boston to buy my first golden flute, actually, which I'm still playing today.
Well, I definitely, we heard you live when you came to Boston and performed at Jordan Hall, and you played the Prokofiev Sonata. And there were things about that, you know, just made a big mark on all of us that were so beautiful. And so it wasn't just recordings. I feel it's your live performances that are pushing us forward. So thank you. So back to your life story. I read you were very, very young when you started flute, or when you first wanted to learn the flute. Could you tell us the story of how you decided to play the flute and how it all began?
Yeah, it's already relatively simple. It hit me. It's quite simple. It hit me when I was 5 years old. It struck me because we moved in a new place in Rome, in Italy, with my parents, and the family next door, or rather upstairs, was a musical family. My parents had no musical background. My family had absolutely no artistic background. And there we go upstairs. There's a family with 4 children, so 6 people altogether, and all of them were playing a music instrument. The father was playing the flute and one of his sons also. I could hear the piano, the cello, and the violin as well. And I was just fascinated by this thing I was hearing next door. It was like, bum, 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 you know, and I started singing this when I was 5 years old and dancing on this music. Every time I heard it, made me happy. So I went to the neighbors and we asked, "What's this music that our little one is dancing and is singing on?" And they said, "Oh, that's Mozart Flute Concerto Number 1." All right, I said, "I want to play Mozart Flute Concerto Number 1." I had no idea what I was getting into. And I will be still talking about this today. But now, 45 years old later, I've been playing Mozart Flute Concerto Number 1 500 times, and Number 2 another 500 times as well, and the Flute and Harp maybe 100 times. And I'm still having so much fun as a kid, as when I was a kid, when I'm playing this music. It's a privilege. I find it elevating for the soul, whether it's in a concert performance, whether you're in a rehearsal, whatever. It doesn't matter. Every time I play Mozart, I play Bach, I play Debussy, I play Prokofiev, I play the pieces I like, the music I love. It's like an elevation of the spirit and the mind, and it makes me hopefully a good person, at least for the moment I'm playing this music. And it's certainly something when you experience that yourself, that probably in the concert situation is carrying across stage, and also going to other people listening to you in the moment of the performance. At least this is how I've been receiving music as a kid when I was a listener, and now that I'm a performer, this is what I want to give to my audience. Can't hear you now. Yes.
Yes. So your parents were not musicians, you said, and so how do you feel they recognized your talent when you were young, and then how did they know to get you in proper hands for your training?
Honestly, they had no idea, and that was something that was filling me with pride and responsibility. I was doing my thing, and as long as my teachers and I had the feeling that I was doing it well, and that they get this feedback from the teachers as well, then they were satisfied. And I was avoiding trouble, both at home and on stage. But I was not a fast learner. I wasn't. I started very early, but I didn't go on stage very quickly, very early. It took me several years until I first performed a little exam here, there, another little concert, one piece in another concert there, etc. And it's only 10, 12 years later that I started appearing a little more regularly on stage. It was still youth concerts and these kind of things. It was not yet a professional environment. It was a very supportive environment, but I was trying to meet the standards of the great recordings I was listening to, in a way. I was certainly not achieving that, but compared maybe to other kids who didn't have this source of information, because then when I started learning music, my parents started buying tickets and go to the concerts, take me there, and then to buy recordings, to listen to recordings. They asked the neighbors who were musicians, what should we listen to? Who are the good musicians and why? They tried to understand, So instead of going to, to museums or to read books or stories, my parents were very interested in my cultural background. Same for my brother. And since we were both into music, they tried to understand what this music is about. What part of our culture is it? And this is how we started getting a good, solid knowledge about music beyond just learning the instruments. How to play the instrument. This we did with the neighbors, but the more general cultural thing about it and how it fits in what we are, what our society is today, and where composition may be projecting us in the future, modern art, etc., commission works, working with composers nowadays. Where does that come from, basically? And this kind of information you need from a more general cultural background, actually, and information. Now, of course, when I was a kid, it was back in 1975, we're talking about when I started picking the flute. There were another 25 years to go until we had internet, until we could access information instantly like this. So we had to go to the library, get books, read them, report, talk about this. We went to the concerts. Again, we talked about things. There were a lot of forums like this in order to learn from each other. each person who liked something really start talking about it. It could be in the family, could be in the class, could be in the music class, could be more generally in the school. But this form of exchange, I think, is something very important that was really existing very strongly in my generation. And I think I learned a lot from the others too.
Wow, that's powerful. Now, your family moved a lot when you were around the world, really, when you were growing up. And how did that impact your flute training?
Yeah, actually, we didn't move so much around the world, but we moved a lot across Europe. But fortunately, from the moment I started going to school, they tried to stabilize their travel a little bit more. And therefore, I started 4 years in Rome and then 7 years in Brussels. And then instead of going to college, I decided I wanted to become a flute player. So they sent me to audition to several places in the French flute school training, and in the end I landed in the Paris Conservatory. It's always a very selective audition to enter there, still is today. It's a very prestigious school, and you can see also it's really for virtuosic performance, I would say, more than for the general musical background. But it's exactly what I needed at that moment. I needed to train my instrumental skills at a further level in order to gain access and command of the instrument in this way. And let me say at this point that all the sometimes people say, okay, well, then you got the job in Berlin when you were 22 or something like that. And then you were following the footsteps of Jimmy Galway or of Aurel Nicolet, for example, etc. That's partly true. But what is also true is that both of them, before they auditioned for Berlin, they also spent a couple of years in Paris in the conservatory and got some fine tuning in the flute playing and some polishing in the flute skills, in the technical skills, and in the air control, the articulation, all of these things. You learn how to master them so that so that they don't become a problem anymore when you face a musical context when it's required to play with an extreme accuracy or at amazing speeds or in amazing dynamics in very difficult ranges, for example.
Could you talk with us about some of your early teachers or the teachers that you worked with at the Paris Conservatory or Nicolet and the impact that they had on you?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, they're slowly dying out one after the other. Like my Aurel Nicolet passed away a couple of years ago. Then my very first teacher, who was a school friend of his, François Binet, who was my neighbor in Rome, passed away exactly a year ago. Well, I'm still in touch with the families, with the widows and with the children. Then the other teachers I had in Brussels, Michel Moinil, who had this particularity that he was sitting in a wheelchair because of an accident while he was climbing a mountain. And before that, he was a pianist. And since he could not use the pedals anymore, he had to learn another instrument. And he switched to the flute and learned it really quickly. And he communicated to me later on this passion about the piano part while you're learning to play a flute sonata, for example. He was always wanting to go himself on the piano and play for us the piano part. And I found this fascinating, and it gave me and all the other students who were there at a very early stage an insight into what the bigger picture of this flute piece is. Not just master a flute part, but to see how it fits with the piano part in the context. Where do you need to breathe in order to hide your breath? Not necessarily where you feel more comfortable about it, but where it actually serves the musical matter in a better way. These are the kind of things that you can learn much better when you're actually playing with the piano part, for example, in a sonata or in a version of a concerto that has a reduction with a piano. And then I also learned a lot from a then young guy who's now one of the senior members of the Belgian Opera House, Carlos Brunel. And he opened my mind a lot because he was the only one from all my teachers who was not from the French flute school. So he opened me a lot to the Dutch and to the English music world, because he was from the Flemish part of Belgium. And since they would do things that were different than the French part of Belgium, they would connect a lot more with the English flute school or with Dutch research on period instruments and these kind of things. So therefore I gained with him an idea that there's a boundary to my knowledge and that I need to look beyond this cultural thing in order to get more information. And I think this has enabled me, after my studies in Paris through the French Flute School, to go across, to go to Switzerland, then to go to Germany, and then to go on tour worldwide and be able to play in various cultures with various ways of music making.